The waiter served an old man alone for months, but what he left on the table one day. The first time James noticed the old man, he was stirring cold coffee with a plastic spoon and staring out the window like he was waiting for something or someone who never came. By the third week, the old man's silence had grown louder than any conversation in the cafe. James had only worked at Dalton's Cafe for 2 months, a quiet corner shop tucked behind the park, mostly frequented by regulars. The morning crowd was always the same: dog walkers with muddy shoes, retirees with newspapers, and rush commuters with cell phones glued to their ears. But the old man didn't belong to any of those categories. He didn't check a phone, didn't read a paper, didn't talk to anyone. He just sat there, always at the same corner booth by the window, every Tuesday and Thursday at exactly 9 a.m. James, 22, fresh out of community college, had taken the job to save up for anything that felt like a life beyond his parents' basement. He wasn't trying to uncover stories, but something about this old man bothered him, like a tune stuck in your head that you can't name. He wore a flat cap, always the same faded brown one. His jacket was clean but frayed at the sleeves, and his shoes looked like they'd walked decades. When James brought over the usual black coffee and a cinnamon scone, no butter, the man would nod politely, whisper a soft "thank you," and return to his window. Nothing about it was remarkable, until it was. It was a cold Thursday in March when the man didn't show up. James noticed immediately. The booth felt strangely empty, like a chair pulled away mid-conversation. He kept glancing at the door all morning. No flat cap, no coat, no old leather shoes tracking in city dust. He came back the following Tuesday. James brought the usual without being asked. "Missed you last week," he said casually, trying not to sound like he cared too much. The old man looked up slowly, his eyes red-rimmed, but kind. "Life makes room for grief," he said softly, "whether we want it to or not." James blinked. "Everything okay?" The man smiled faintly, sadly. "My wife used to say that whenever I got impatient. Life makes room for grief. She passed last year. But last week, I missed her more than usual." James didn't know what to say. 1,000 phrases came to mind. "I'm sorry. That's hard. I understand," but none felt right. He just nodded. The old man sipped his coffee, eyes returning to the window. "This was our spot. Every week. For 23 years. That was the first time James realized the man wasn't alone by choice. In the following weeks, James paid more attention. There was something ritualistic about the man's visits. 2 sips of coffee before breaking the scone. Always broke it in half. Always left one half untouched. He'd place it gently across from him, as if saving it for someone. "She liked cinnamon," he once said, catching James' stare. "Hated butter. Said it ruined the texture." Every time he left, he tucked a small envelope beneath the sugar jar. At first, James thought it was a tip. But when he opened one, out of sheer curiosity, he found a folded napkin with a handwritten note. "I saw a woman today who wore your perfume. I followed her for a block. I knew it wasn't you. But still, I followed." James didn't mention it. He just slid the note back under the jar. But he started collecting them quietly. Not to steal, but to understand. Over the next few weeks, the notes formed a mosaic of a love so deep, it had no place to go but into ink. I played our song on the old radio. It still skips at the same part. It made me cry. You would have laughed at that. I cleaned the attic. Found your old letters. I read them again. You used to doodle hearts in the margins. I never noticed before." James never told anyone. One morning in May, the man looked more tired than usual. His hands trembled as he sipped the coffee. James sat down across from him for the first time. "You all right?" he asked, breaking the silence. The old man hesitated. "Do you believe people can die of heartbreak?" James shrugged. "I think it stays in the body. Grief. If you carry it long enough, maybe it becomes a part of you." The old man nodded slowly. "I've been waiting for her, hoping that maybe some piece of her still lingers here. In this cafe, in this booth, in me." They sat in silence for a long time. Before he left, the old man placed a thicker envelope under the jar. James didn't touch it. Not yet. The man didn't return that Thursday, or the next Tuesday. James waited a week. Then 2. He checked obituaries. No name. Asked around the neighborhood. No one knew who he was. Just the quiet man at Dalton's Cafe. On the 3rd week, James finally opened the thick envelope. Inside was a letter, folded neatly, yellowed with age. It read, "To whoever finds this. If you're reading this, I've gone to find her. My love. My Eileen." Tell the young man, James, I believe thank you for the kindness. He reminded me that love, even when quiet, still echoes. This table held my life, my joy, my loss, my goodbye. Please, don't clear it too quickly. Tears filled James' eyes before he realized it. He looked out the window. Same view, same light, same empty chair. But something felt different, lighter, like a chapter had closed. He left the booth untouched for the rest of the day, just in case love decided to visit once more. James didn't touch the table for days. At first, his manager raised an eyebrow. That corner's been empty all morning. You forget to bus it. James shook his head. Someone left something behind. He didn't explain more, and to his surprise, no one pressed him. Maybe they sensed it too, that the empty booth wasn't just empty. That something invisible still lingered there, patient and quiet, like the final breath of a story not yet done. James kept the notes in a small tin he had once used to hold sugar packets. Each one was folded neatly, some on napkins, others on torn corners of receipts, the writing delicate and looping, like someone used to writing letters instead of texts. He would read them at night, sometimes aloud, sometimes silently, and every time he did, he felt like he was sitting across from something sacred. The days are longer now, but somehow darker. I miss the way you used to open the curtains and scold me for sleeping in. They changed the cafe menu, took the apple pie off. You would have raised hell. There were dozens. James had never known love like that. At 22, his longest relationship had lasted 6 months and ended with a voicemail. But reading those notes felt like being let in on a secret one that made the world seem both heavier and more beautiful. One day, as James was closing up, an elderly woman with silver hair and deep smile lines stepped in. She looked around the cafe slowly, her eyes lingering on the corner booth. Is this place still open for real coffee? She asked, smiling gently. James chuckled. As real as it gets. He served her a cup and noticed her glance back at the booth once more. That was their spot, wasn't it? She said quietly, as though she was speaking into memory instead of the present. James looked up. You knew him. I knew both of them, Eileen and Walter. She stirred her coffee slowly. They used to come here every Thursday before I started going to church across the street. I'd wave at them through the window. She paused, eyes soft. They were the kind of couple that made you believe it was still possible. That kind of love. James leaned forward slightly. Do you know what happened to him? The woman nodded slowly. Eileen passed last year. Cancer. Quiet and fast. Walter, he didn't come out much after that, except for here. James felt his throat tighten. I think he was writing to her. He left letters. The woman looked toward the booth. That sounds like Walter. She always said he had a poet's heart. They sat in silence for a while, sipping coffee and sharing a grief neither of them had the language to describe. It was a strange sort of bond, two people connected not by memories they shared, but by a man who had stitched his mourning into the seams of an ordinary cafe. Weeks passed, then months. The booth eventually filled again, but never for long. It was as though people could sense it wasn't truly available. Like the air around it had grown heavier with memory. James still kept the letters, tucked inside a notebook he'd started. On the cover, he wrote, for her, for him, for those who wait. He began writing his own reflections beside the letters, thoughts about love, grief, the way time feels slower when you're sitting with absence. One entry read, we talk about moving on like it's something we're supposed to do fast. But maybe staying in place is a kind of honoring too. Maybe not rushing away from pain is how we prove the love was real. One rainy Tuesday, a man in a suit came into the cafe and asked about Walter. He was in his 40s, with tired eyes and a briefcase that looked too clean for the rain. I'm his nephew, he explained. Name's Marcus. I was going through his things and found a note about this place. James sat him down and poured him a cup of coffee. He showed him the tin box with the notes and the envelope Walter had left behind. Marcus stared at them for a long time without speaking. I always thought Uncle Walt was distant, grumpy, didn't come to holidays, kept to himself. James said nothing, just watched him wrestle with the truth of a man he never really knew. After a while, Marcus sighed. I didn't know he loved someone like that. I didn't know he still came here. James nodded. He didn't just come here. He waited here. The man took one of the notes, read it, then folded it carefully and placed it back. Thank you, he said, for noticing him. James nodded again, but this time his voice cracked when he replied, it was impossible not to. That night, James stayed after close. He lit a small candle and placed it in the center of the booth. Then, Without really knowing why, he took out a napkin and a pen and wrote a note of his own. You waited so long for her. I hope you found her now. And I hope where you are, there's a booth by the window. He left it under the sugar jar and locked the door behind him. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the streets still shimmered like mirrors. As James walked home, he thought about how we pass by people every day silent, still, seemingly alone, but how inside they might be holding 1,000 tiny memories that no one else can see. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you get invited to witness them. James had always thought grief was a private thing, something people wore quietly, like a hidden bruise. But ever since Walter's booth went empty, grief had started showing up in other faces too. There was the young woman who came in every Wednesday afternoon, always with a fresh tear in her eye. She sat by the window and stared at her phone without ever unlocking it. Then there was the man with the service dog who ordered 2 cups of coffee, one he never touched. James noticed these things now, the subtle ways people mourned what couldn't be said out loud. One slow morning, James opened the cafe early. Rain drummed steadily on the windows. The street outside was empty except for one old woman with a cane who shuffled past without stopping. James didn't turn the music on. He just let the rain fill the room. He slid into Walter's old booth with a notebook in hand. This time, he didn't write about Walter. He wrote about himself. I used to think love came easy. That you met someone, dated, moved in, fought over dishes, and stayed together because it was convenient. I didn't understand love was a practice. Something you return to, over and over, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. He didn't know if anyone would read what he wrote, but writing it helped. The old booth had become a confessional. A quiet place where memory was both a burden and a gift. Where James could let down the performative smile he wore behind the counter. Where truth didn't have to sound strong. That day, he stayed in the booth until his manager arrived. You all right? She asked, eyebrow raised. James nodded, just keeping a promise. She didn't ask what he meant. That summer, the cafe hired a new waitress. Her name was Lila, and she was all sharp cheekbones and quick wit, with a tattoo of a paper crane behind her left ear. She was 3 years older than James, and had worked at diners all over the coast. Said she'd moved back to town to take care of her dad, who was recovering from a stroke. James didn't think much of her at first until she asked about the booth. Why's that corner always got a candle on it? She said, wiping down menus. Looks like a shrine. James smiled softly. In a way, it is. He told her about Walter. About the notes. About the love that waited across from an empty seat for months. Lila didn't say anything for a while. Then she whispered, damn. That's beautiful. From then on, she never cleared the booth without asking first. Sometimes she added a flower to the table or rearranged the sugar jar so the candle looked framed in light. They became a team. Quietly, reverently, they preserved that small sacred space. It was Lila who asked the question James had been too afraid to voice out loud. You ever wonder why it hit you so hard? That man. They were cleaning up after a long shift, the cafe quiet, the windows glowing amber in the late dusk. James looked up from the dish bin. Yeah, he said after a moment. I think it's because he wasn't trying to be seen. He didn't want attention. He just loved her. That was it. It wasn't performative. It wasn't loud. It was just steady. Lila nodded. Like the tide. James smiled. Yeah, like the tide. They sat in silence, soaking in the kind of understanding you don't need to explain. After a moment, Lila spoke again. You ever think about finding someone like that? James hesitated. I didn't used to, but now I think I'd wait forever for a love like that. In late August, something unexpected happened. A reporter showed up at the cafe. A woman in her 40s with a kind smile and a notepad that had seen better days. I'm writing a piece on forgotten corners, she said, places where people leave behind stories. Someone told me to check this cafe. James looked at Lila, who raised her hands innocently. Wasn't me, she mouthed. Still, they invited the woman in, gave her a cinnamon scone and a coffee, and told her the story. The booth. The old man. The notes. The last envelope. The reporter listened without interrupting. When James finished, she leaned back and whispered, that's something else. She took photos of the booth, the sugar jar, even the candle. The article came out 2 weeks later. The man who waited, love, loss, and a booth by the window. It went viral. People started coming into the cafe asking about the corner. Some left letters. Others brought candles or flowers. A few sat silently in the booth for an hour before quietly leaving. James started a small wooden box labeled Messages for the Ones We Mississippi. By the end of the month, it was full. The cafe became a kind of pilgrimage site for people with invisible wounds. One morning, James came in to find a young man in his early 30s sitting at Walter's booth. He had a scar along his chin and held a folded American flag on his lap. James walked over quietly. "Can I get you anything?" The man looked up, eyes red but steady. "Coffee. Black. And maybe just a little time." James nodded and stepped away. Later, when the man left, James found a note under the sugar jar. Her name was Melissa. "We danced in the kitchen every Sunday morning. I still play her song. I still keep her mug on the shelf. Thank you for giving me a place to say goodbye." James added it to the notebook, gently. That fall, James took a risk. He applied to a writing program out of state. Not because he was ready to leave, but because he realized something. The cafe had shown him how powerful stories could be, not just the ones in books, but the ones that lived in people. The ones no one asked to tell, but somehow needed to. He didn't expect to get in, but he did. He told Lila first. She hugged him hard. "You better write about this place," she said. "I already am," he replied. Before he left, he made one last visit to the booth. He brought a fresh candle, a cinnamon scone, and a new notebook. On the first page, he wrote, "Dear Walter, I never knew your last name, but I knew your love, and that was more than enough." He left the notebook on the table with a note attached. "For anyone who needs to say what couldn't be said, this booth listens." When James boarded the bus out of town, he looked out the window at the cafe as it disappeared around the corner. He didn't feel like he was leaving something behind. He felt like he was carrying something forward. A kind of grief that had been transformed into meaning. A kind of love that lived quietly in the hearts of strangers. A kind of story that never truly ended. Winter crept in slowly. The cafe's windows fogged up most mornings now, and the regulars came bundled in scarves and quiet weariness. James was gone, but his absence wasn't a void, it was a presence of its own. Lila had stepped into his old routine, and every now and then, she caught herself repeating phrases the way he used to. "Coffee's on the house if your heart's heavy," she once told an old man who looked like he hadn't slept in days. He just nodded and took a seat at Walter's booth. The notebook James had left remained on the table. Lila replaced the candle each week. The scone was no longer left out, it molded too quickly in the cold, but fresh flowers appeared now and then, left by customers who never gave their names. People still came. Not in crowds. Not with cameras or flashy curiosity. Just people who heard whispers. Who saw the article. Who found themselves unable to forget the phrase, "the man who waited." One afternoon, a teenage boy came in, backpack soaked from snow, lips trembling. He asked if he could sit there, and Lila nodded. He didn't order anything. He just sat and cried, silently, shoulders shaking. When he left, Lila found a note in the notebook. "My mom hasn't spoken since my dad died. I didn't know where else to go. This place felt like maybe someone would understand." Lila pressed her palm to the page for a long time. Then she added a sticky note below it. "We do." Back at school, James struggled to adjust. The writing program was rigorous, and his classmates often spoke in abstract metaphors or literary jargon that made him feel small. Most of them were younger, louder, quicker to quote Kafka or Woolf or some obscure postmodern poet. He kept quiet in workshops, turning in pieces he wasn't proud of. One night, he pulled out the notes from Walter again. He read them slowly. Then he flipped through his own notebook, the reflections he'd written in the booth, the moments he hadn't dared share in class. And something clicked. The next day, he turned in a short story. The Man at Table 7. It was raw, unpolished. It didn't follow traditional structure, but it was honest. It began with a single line. He never said a word, but he never needed to. His professor asked to speak to him after class. "I don't know where that came from," she said, eyes glinting. "But you need to write more like that." James nodded, a little stunned. "It's not really fiction," he said. "Doesn't matter," she replied. "What matters is that it's alive." Weeks turned into months. James kept writing. He found himself drawn not to grand plots or complex characters, but to stillness, to ordinary moments that held extraordinary weight. He wrote about a woman folding her late husband's sweaters, about a man who visited the same park bench every Sunday because it was the last place his wife smiled. Each story had one thing in common: someone waiting, for memory, for healing, for someone who would never come back. And each time he wrote, James thought of Walter. Meanwhile, back at the cafe, something unexpected happened. A woman named Claire started coming in every Thursday. She was in her 60s, with soft eyes and hands that trembled slightly when she held her teacup. She always ordered chamomile, always asked for the same booth. Walter's booth. At first, Lila hesitated. But then she recognized something in the way Claire sat down, as if she was lowering herself into a memory. "Do you know what this place is?" Lila asked gently one afternoon. Claire looked up, smiling faintly. "I do. That's why I'm here." And then she placed a photo on the table. It was a picture of her and Walter, much younger, laughing on a beach. "I'm Eileen's sister," she said. Lila froze. Her throat tightened. Claire continued, voice soft. "Walter wrote me after Eileen passed. Said he didn't know how to live without her. I wrote him back once. Told him to find somewhere she still lived. A place where he could talk to her." She touched the table. "I didn't think he'd actually find it." Lila sat across from her, silent. Claire reached into her coat and pulled out an envelope. She slid it across the table. "This was in his apartment. Found it after he passed. I think it was meant to stay here." Inside was a single folded letter. Lila opened it carefully. It read, "To the ones who come after. If you're sitting here, you've lost something. I did too. But I found something as well. A place to remember. A place to speak. A place where silence wasn't empty, but full of her. Leave your grief here, and pick up what's left of your hope. Walter." Claire placed her hand on Lila's. "You've kept this place alive. Thank you." Lila didn't speak. She just nodded, tears in her eyes. That night, Lila called James. He picked up after 2 rings. "I just met Eileen's sister," she whispered, her voice shaking. James went still. "What?" She came to the booth. She knew everything. "Walter," he told her. James leaned against his dorm wall, eyes closed. "Did she say anything about him?" Lila told him everything. When she finished, there was a long pause. Then James said, "I think I need to come home for a weekend." When James returned to the cafe, it was snowing. He walked in quietly, heart pounding. Lila was wiping down the counter. She looked up, startled, then smiled. "You're late," she said. He grinned. "You're still bad at coffee art." She threw a dish towel at him. And then she hugged him. Hard. They stood like that for a while. Later, they sat together at Walter's booth. James brought with him a new notebook. On the front, Table 7, Where Grief Became Story. Inside were stories from his classmates. Notes from strangers he'd met on buses and trains. Drawings. Poems. Even a letter from his professor. All about people who had lost and still dared to speak. Lila opened to the middle and added Claire's letter. Together, they lit a candle. The flame flickered, casting soft gold shadows. James spoke softly. "I thought leaving would mean the story was over. But it wasn't. It just changed chapters." Lila nodded. "And it keeps getting passed on." James smiled. "Let's make sure it never stops." Spring arrived earlier than expected. The cafe's windows, once fogged with winter breath, now shimmered with golden light. Fresh tulips appeared in the flower box outside. And the booth, Walter's booth, was never empty anymore. People came every week. Sometimes they sat alone. Sometimes with someone they'd lost, not in body, but in spirit. Often, they wrote. The notebook had become more than paper and ink. It was a map of heartbreak and hope. A nurse wrote about the night her mother forgot her name. A little girl drew a picture of her dog who'd passed away. A father left a letter for the son he hadn't seen in 5 years. And for every word left behind, something subtle changed. The grief didn't vanish, but it softened. Became a part of the table's grain, the warmth of the mug, the light through the window. James returned more frequently now, sometimes staying for a few days, sometimes just one afternoon. He had started speaking at small readings, sharing stories from the notebook, anonymous, but deeply human. He called them Letters from Table 7. Audiences wept, laughed. Some stayed after to hug him, to say, "Thank you for giving my pain a place to go." And he always replied the same way. "It wasn't me. I was just the one who noticed him." One warm Saturday in May, something unexpected happened. A woman in her late 20s walked into the cafe. Her hair was clipped back neatly, and she held a worn leather satchel to her chest. She didn't order anything. She simply walked to the booth, looked at the notebook, and ran her fingers across the cover like it was something sacred. Lila approached gently. "You're welcome to sit." The woman hesitated, then nodded, sliding into the seat like she'd done it 100 times in her mind. My grandfather used to come here, she said softly. Walter. Lila froze. The woman smiled gently. I didn't know until last week. My Aunt Claire sent me the article. Said he used to write here. Sit here. Love here. Her eyes were glassy. I didn't know him well. My mom and he didn't speak much after Grandma died. I always thought he was a quiet man who never got over her. But I didn't know he was. She gestured to the booth, the notebook, the candle, this. She opened the notebook slowly. Read. Sat for a long time. And then she pulled out her own envelope. Inside was a photo of Walter as a young man, standing on a porch with a child on his shoulders. That's my mom, she whispered. She placed the photo inside the notebook and then added her own letter. To the man I didn't know but who knew how to love better than most. I promise to remember you this way, not by absence, but by everything you left behind. She stood. Lila placed a hand over hers. He changed this place, she said. The woman smiled. Seems like he changed more than that. Years passed. The cafe never became a tourist trap. That wasn't its fate. It remained quietly sacred. Word spread gently, person to person. A teacher telling a student. A son telling his mother. A hospice nurse telling the daughter of a patient who no longer spoke. People came. They wrote. They grieved. They healed. Sometimes they left behind photographs. Or tokens. One woman left her wedding ring with a note. He died before we made it to Paris. But I made it here. This is enough. Lila eventually bought the cafe when the original owner retired. She kept everything the same. Except for one thing. She had a plaque made for the booth. Small. Brass. Set into the wall beside the window. It read, Table 7. In memory of all we carry. And all we let go. James became a published author. His first book was titled simply, The Booth. He dedicated it to Walter. And to anyone who had ever lost someone and still found the courage to speak. He never tried to fictionalize the story. It was enough as it was. Raw. Real. Quietly extraordinary. One night, James returned to the cafe for its 10th anniversary under Lila's ownership. It was raining, just like the first night Walter had walked in all those years ago. The place was full, but not loud. Just warm. At table 7, a young woman sat alone, tears on her cheeks, a pen in her hand. James didn't interrupt. He watched as she finished her note and placed it gently into the current notebook volume 9 now and stood, lighter somehow. As she left, she passed him. Their eyes met. She didn't need to say anything. James simply nodded. He turned back to the booth and walked slowly over. He opened the notebook. Inside, the woman had written, He never got to hold his daughter, but I think he would have liked this place. I feel closer to him here than anywhere else. James closed the book and placed his hand over it. Then, softly, he said the same words Walter had once written. Leave your grief here, and pick up what's left of your hope. He sat at the booth for a while, candle flickering beside him, tulips blooming outside the window. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a stillness he hadn't known he was waiting for. Not closure, but something gentler. A kind of peace. Some stories don't end. They echo. They fold into other stories. They become part of the way someone loves, or remembers, or holds a hand in the dark. The waiter who noticed the old man. The old man who waited without asking anything in return. The people who came, quietly, carrying hearts that had once been full. All of them still lived here. At the booth. In the light. In the flame. The end.